This scene might seem confusing at first. A man holds two girls, both covered in blood, while gently comforting them. When the girl's father sees this, he attacks the man, thinking he's to blame. A policeman gets involved, pointing a gun at the man's head in disgust, assuming he's guilty. But in reality, the man is actually trying to rescue the girls. Despite his efforts, he gets wrongly convicted of murder and gets sentenced to death. The man in question is named John Coffey. Before this incident, nobody had ever heard of him. When he arrived at the prison, a guard named Percy Wetmore loudly announced the arrival of a death row inmate. The warden, Paul Edgecombe, felt uneasy and stepped in quickly. John Coffey, a giant of a man twice the size of most people, seemed troubled. His eyes showed innocence and clarity. Paul Edgecombe couldn't help but ask if something was wrong. John Coffey timidly asked if the lights could stay on at night because he was scared of the dark, especially in a strange place. He seemed more like a simple-minded child than a dangerous criminal. This piqued Paul Edgecombe's curiosity, leading him to investigate John Coffey's background. It turned out that John Coffey was accused of murdering two young girls. When the girls' father and the police found him, he was holding their bodies, crying and grieving. He muttered that he had tried to save them but failed. Paul Edgecombe found it hard to believe. John seemed more like a gentle giant than a cold-hearted killer. However, the case was closed, and there seemed to be no point in dwelling on it further. The next day, the guards were tasked with picking up a prisoner from the hospital. This prisoner seemed mentally challenged, constantly drooling and unresponsive. The guards had to dress him and bring him back to the prison. But as soon as they opened the cell door, the prisoner attacked them. Seeing a guard being strangled, Paul Edgecombe rushed to help but got kicked in the groin. Thankfully, another guard arrived just in time to subdue Wild Bill. As the chaos settled, Paul Edgecombe, overwhelmed by pain and exhaustion, collapsed to the ground. Paul had been battling illness for years. During the day, he endured excruciating pain just to use the restroom, and at night, he often woke up in agony, rushing to the bathroom. Sometimes, the pain was so intense that he couldn't even make it to the bathroom in time. The recent incident had taken a toll on Paul Edgecombe's health, spreading pain throughout his body and causing sweat to bead on his forehead. At that instant, John Coffey unexpectedly requested to see Paul Edgecombe. Out of respect for the prisoner, Paul Edgecombe struggled to rise. But just as he was about to inquire about John Coffey's request, the prison light bulb suddenly brightened. John Coffey released his grip, and Paul Edgecombe felt an instant relief from pain. He stared in amazement at John Coffey, who seemed to be in great discomfort. John Coffey began coughing violently, and suddenly, thousands of black bugs flew out of his mouth, vanishing into thin air. Paul Edgecombe watched in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. He couldn't help but ask John Coffey what had happened. Weary, John Coffey replied, "I healed you." Paul Edgecombe, feeling unbelievably relieved, headed to the restroom. It was such a relief, and he realized even using the restroom could be enjoyable. John Coffey's divine power made Paul Edgecombe respect him even more. Could someone like him really be a murderer? The next day, Paul Edgecombe sought out John Coffey's defense attorney. The lawyer described John Coffey as a man who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. No one knew anything about his past, and he had no criminal record. To show gratitude to John Coffey, Paul Edgecombe brought bread made by his wife. Kind-hearted John Coffey shared the bread with Edward Delacroix, who was imprisoned across from him. This angered Wild Bill Wharton, who cursed at John Coffey. Paul Edgecombe intervened, but Wild Bill Wharton spat at him. Though Paul Edgecombe tried to ignore it, Wild Bill Wharton's arrogance only grew, constantly trying to humiliate the guards. One day, as Percy Wetmore passed by, Wild Bill Wharton grabbed him and insulted him. Percy Wetmore struggled, and when released, his pants were wet. Percy Wetmore, usually arrogant and bullying, was now humiliated. Seeing Percy Wetmore in such a state, Edward Delacroix burst into laughter. This further fueled Percy Wetmore's hatred towards Edward Delacroix, vowing to make his life miserable. One day, Edward Delacroix's pet mouse, his companion and solace, ran out of the cell. Percy Wetmore saw an opportunity and deliberately stepped on the mouse, causing Edward Delacroix immense sorrow. John Coffey intervened, miraculously healing the mouse, leaving everyone stunned. Revived from death, it was beyond their comprehension. After some time, Paul Edgecombe, who had regained his senses along with the guards, found Percy Wetmore and demanded that he leave the prison. Such a wicked person didn't deserve to stay there. However, Percy Wetmore argued that he was at the prison to conduct an execution himself, and to expedite his departure, Paul Edgecombe reluctantly agreed. A few days later, Paul Edgecombe visited Edward Delacroix's cell. It was the day of Edward Delacroix's execution, and what troubled him the most was the little mouse. To comfort Edward Delacroix, Paul Edgecombe fabricated a story about a nearby mouse village, a popular spot where mice enjoyed food, drink, and entertainment. Edward Delacroix smiled with relief upon hearing this, finally able to leave without worry. As the time for the execution drew near, Edward Delacroix became increasingly despondent. He pleaded, "Don't forget about the mouse village." But Percy Wetmore cruelly responded, "There's no such place. They made it up to fool you." With malice in his heart, Percy Wetmore wanted Edward Delacroix to die with regret. Seeing Edward Delacroix's anguish, Percy Wetmore gleefully placed a hood over his head. Before an execution, a wet sponge is placed on the prisoner's head to ensure the electric current flows quickly, minimizing pain and shortening the process. But Percy Wetmore neglected this. To spite Edward Delacroix, he pretended to wet the sponge and placed it on his head. As the switch was thrown, Edward Delacroix's screams filled the prison. Smoke poured from his head, revealing that the sponge had been tampered with. Pulling the switch now would only prolong Edward Delacroix's suffering. Helplessly, Paul Edgecombe watched as Edward Delacroix endured excruciating pain, his body slowly burning. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, horrifying onlookers, who fled in fear. At that moment, John Coffey, who was assisting with the mouse, suddenly started shaking violently, drenched in sweat. He had this special ability to feel others' pain, and now he was feeling Edward Delacroix's agony. Shaking, he accidentally transferred his divine power to the mouse he was holding, feeling the owner's pain. The mouse darted out of the prison in a frenzy. Percy Wetmore, witnessing Edward Delacroix's execution, showed no concern and even ignored the fact that the sponge was supposed to be wet. This infuriated one of the guards, who punched Percy Wetmore in the face. Later, Paul Edgecombe visited the prison to check on the little mouse and John Coffey. John Coffey, with a heavy heart, muttered, "I'm exhausted." Paul understood that John Coffey's exhaustion wasn't physical but the frustration of wanting to help but feeling powerless. During a break, Paul visited his friend's house with his wife. Learning about his friend's wife's terminal brain cancer, Paul was deeply saddened. That night, he couldn't sleep, brainstorming an audacious idea. He wanted John Coffey to use his divine power to heal his friend's wife. The following night, Paul gathered his fellow guards and devised an escape plan. To avoid detection, they first subdued Wild Bill Wharton and then disciplined Percy Wetmore in the Bree as a cover. But just as they were about to sneak John Coffey out, Wild Bill Wharton, still under the influence, grabbed John Coffey's hand. John Coffey trembled, sensing something, but they had no time to waste. Paul pulled Wild Bill Wharton away and led John Coffey out. Under the starlit sky, John Coffey wore an innocent smile. Taking advantage of the darkness, they reached their friend's house, where the friend, startled by the noise, aimed a gun at John Coffey. Unfazed, John Coffey walked into the bedroom, his extraordinary ability already feeling the woman's pain. She looked weary, her eyes showing her worsening condition. When John Coffey came in, she got really nervous, almost panicking on the bed. But once he sat beside her, she started feeling calmer. He kissed her, and suddenly, the room lit up brightly, even the clock downstairs stopped ticking. It was like a miracle. She felt instantly better, like she'd been given a new lease on life. All the pain and memories of her sickness just vanished into thin air. Their friend couldn't contain his happiness, shedding tears of joy and embracing his wife tightly. But all this healing seemed to drain John Coffey. Instead of getting rid of the dark insects like usual, he collapsed, coughing uncontrollably. That's when the woman noticed him, feeling like he was now a part of her life. With tears in her eyes, she took off her necklace and put it around John Coffey's neck, hoping it would keep him safe. Soon after, the guards took the exhausted John Coffey back to prison, afraid of what might happen. Paul Edgecombe let Percy Wetmore go quickly, but he had revenge on his mind, wearing a grim expression. Suddenly, John Coffey grabbed Percy Wetmore's throat, and chaos broke out. He spat all those dark insects into Percy Wetmore's mouth, leaving him vacant, like he was in a daze. Wild Bill Wharton, who had just woken up, started taunting Percy Wetmore as usual. But this time, Percy Wetmore pulled out his gun and started shooting wildly. The guards were caught off guard, trying to stop him. They managed to take the gun away, but Wild Bill Wharton was already dead. Percy Wetmore was pinned down, and those dark insects flew out of his mouth. Paul Edgecombe couldn't understand why the kind-hearted John Coffey would do such a thing. But John Coffey said, "I had to punish them. I saw what they did." Without asking, he transferred his divine power to Paul Edgecombe, giving him the ability to sense others' pain. In a flash, Paul Edgecombe understood what really happened to the two little girls. It turned out that John Coffey wasn't the one who hurt them. The true culprit was Wild Bill Wharton. When John Coffey felt the girls' pain and got there, it was too late. All he could do was hold them, feeling helpless. Seeing this memory, Paul Edgecombe couldn't help but cry. John Coffey had a heart full of kindness, enduring the world's suffering. He was like an angel sent from above. But now, people misunderstood him. The only relief was that Wild Bill Wharton got what he deserved, and Percy Wetmore was sent to a mental hospital for his madness. The prison went back to how it was before. Paul Edgecombe knew John Coffey was innocent, but the real criminal was gone. In a case with no proof, even if he spoke up in court, no one would believe him. Paul Edgecombe felt deeply sorry but couldn't change anything. So he went to the prison to set John Coffey free, but John Coffey refused. He said, "I'm worn out. I need closure. I'm tired of wandering, feeling lonely like a duckweed in the rain, tired of being friendless, tired of facing pain every single day, and most of all, I'm tired of humanity's ugliness." Paul Edgecombe couldn't do anything but honor John Coffey's decision and fulfill his wishes. John Coffey's only desire was to watch a movie called Heaven. His wish came true, and as the light from the projector shone over him, he looked at the screen with a smile that seemed to have been lost for a long time, almost like an angel. Soon, it was the day of John Coffey's execution. The guards came prepared, each with a serious expression. But John Coffey remained calm. He smiled and told everyone not to worry, as he would soon be set free. As John Coffey entered the room where he would face execution, his mood took a downward turn. He expressed, "I can sense that many people here harbor hatred towards me." A guard reassured him, saying, "Try to understand our perspective. We don't hold any animosity towards you." The guard's compassion eased John Coffey's anxiety as he settled onto the electric chair. However, tears filled the guard's eyes. Paul Edgecombe asked if there was anything else John wanted to say. John Coffey requested, "Please don't cover my head with the hood. I fear the darkness. Angels belong in the light." Paul Edgecombe agreed. When it was time for the electric shock, Paul couldn't bring himself to give the order. He couldn't bear to harm God's creation, the angel who had descended to earth. But he felt powerless. Approaching John Coffey, Paul shook his hand in farewell, his eyes betraying self-blame and reluctance. In that moment, John Coffey found the release he sought. Subsequently, Paul Edgecombe and the guards left the prison over time. Years later, reminiscing while watching the movie Heaven, in a nursing home, Paul was overwhelmed with memories. The elderly Paul couldn't help but burst into tears. He shared this mysterious tale with an old friend who found it unbelievable. Paul then took him to the back mountain, where a cabin stood. Opening the door, a gray-haired mouse crawled out of a cigar box, astonishing the old friend. Yet, it was indeed the same mouse from years ago. When John Coffey passed on his divine power to Paul and the mouse, their lives were prolonged. Paul viewed it as a blessing, enabling them to continue God's miracles. However, it also felt like a punishment, knowing he had sent John Coffey to the electric chair, extinguishing God's miracle. At the ripe old age of 108, he experienced countless marvels but could only stand by as those dear to him departed, one by one. The phrase, "Green Mile," signifies the route from confinement to the place of execution, adorned in verdant hues. Green, symbolizing vitality and renewal. John Coffey emerged as a blessing to humanity, a beacon of compassion and affection. He graced the desolate prison, sacrificing his well-being, showering others with profound love, restoring their spirits, performing wonders along the Green Mile. However, the world lacks celestial beings endowed with divine might to instill warmth and optimism. It's often folks like John Coffey, devoid of pedigree or prestige, who quietly uphold the principles of empathy and affection, shaping a brighter tomorrow. Turn on alerts, like, and subscribe for more videos similar to this one. Thank you for watching.